All right, welcome back. Our moderator for this panel is still at the moment in a traffic jam, so she will take over once she has arrived. So as I was not prepared to do the initial moderation, my introduction of our four distinguished speakers will be more curt, shorter than hers would have been, probably. So we have, as the first speaker, Harry Cross, and the affiliation was again? From Durham University. We have Ingrid Harvold Kvangraven from York University. Tony Obeng from... Okay. You based in Accra? Okay, Tony Obeng from Accra, who has worked for the UN and IBEP and has been a close collaborator of Samir Amin. And we have Okoli Chukwuma from Nigeria. Which university again? The Federal University Lafia. So we'll get started because for the first time, I think, in our conference, we have 4 parallel panels. And each of you will have 15 minutes to talk, so we have some time for Q&A afterwards. So we'll try to be strict. Harry, the floor is yours. Thanks for coming.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Donc, je peux prendre les questions après en anglais ou en français, mais je vais parler en anglais. So I'm presenting some work that comes out of my research into the role of banks and financial institutions in Sudan after decolonization. I thought when I began that I was being an economic historian, then I thought maybe what I'm doing is financial history. And then more recently I've realized with horror that I'm actually an accounting historian. So this is going to be 15 minutes of accounting history. And I'm looking in particular at the ability of accountants to create, define, and enforce capitalist notions of value, and in particular, struggles in the post-colonial context over the ability to define value. So just with regards to the conference topic on monetary sovereignty, when we talk about monetary sovereignty, we often think about state institutions, and in particular, perhaps, the ability of states to create money. But what I'm going to look at in particular is the ability of private and commercial banks to create money, because in most financial capitalist economies, a much greater amount of money is created through the lending activities of commercial banks rather than by the state. And this is maybe my ontological difference with modern monetary theorists, that I think money comes from the lending activities of banks and isn't primarily a creation by the state. And I think these questions are particularly important because lots of African countries have the formal institutions of independence. The point's been made many times that that's not enough for sovereignty. And more than that, African countries mostly became independent at a time when the international financial system under Bretton Woods stressed the importance of national sovereignty, at the expense of private finance. And yet today we're in a world where it seems that that sovereignty has been eroded. Part of that is through to conspiracies hatched in the ex-metropoles against the former colonies. I'm not denying that. But I also want to look at the routine activities of business and capital within which independent countries participate. So just to situate myself very quickly in some literature, the idea that banks create money has been a key insight of Keynesian economics since at least the 1930s. We used to think that what banks do is they reallocate value, they take balances from customers, and they lend it out to people. But of course, most banks, if they give you a loan, don't take a key and unlock a box and give you some gold or banknotes from their stores. They simply record in their books. Today it's on a computer, but this predates digitalization by a long way. They enter in their ledger books a balance for the customer. And that does not affect the level that they hold in physical reserves, be it of gold, silver, or banknotes. And similarly, most transactions in the world are done with this bank money by transferring these accounting entries. Value does not need to take the form of a banknote or bullion or something specific to circulate. So this is the big insight of Keynesian economics, that banks create money. However, Keynes did this in a way to better understand and manage capitalism. He was not part of a critical project to challenge and transform capitalist notions of value. Much more recently, since the 1990s, a field of critical accounting studies has emerged, which argues that accounting is not just a technical, neutral activity of observation, it's a social process that is worthy of being analysed by the tools of social science. In particular, this field stresses that accounting is a diffuse process that's carried out by many actors. What I want to ask is, what can we bring to this field by looking at the post-colonial context, looking at the many different actors that contribute to accounting processes, and looking at different power relations between those actors, particularly as they pertain to the post-colonial world. So as I mentioned, my research looks at the role of banking and financial institutions in Sudan between 1956, when Sudan became independent, and 1970, when the socialist government in Sudan nationalized its entire banking sector. Although the colonial state withdrew from Sudan in 1956, the banks that were operating in Sudan at that time, which were primarily British, French, and Egyptian banks, continued to operate for another 14 years. So I'm interested at how these banks adapted to the arrival of an independent state in Sudan, and similarly at how successive governments understood and sought to reform or control the financial sector. So I look at multiple episodes. I'm going to start by talking about the cotton slump in 1958. So there was a big cotton boom in the international economy from the late 40s onwards, associated with rearmament and the Korean War. Sudan was a huge cotton exporting economy. It was more or less the only show in town, a traditional colonial cash crop economy. And the banks lent heavily to this sector because it requires seasonal finance. So as the banks create these loans, they're bringing new assets into their books simply by routine accounting entries. Today, the criticism made of banks is that they create money that does not really exist or that comes out of thin air. But this is not how the banks understood what they were doing. They did not try to lend out more than they took in customers' balances. They lent it to the cotton economy, which they believed was a sound, stable sector. Loans were short-term. You lent to the cotton sector, and the cotton was exported by the end of the year. It was an export-oriented economy that sold in foreign exchange, stable foreign exchange, mostly in sterling. And there were large traders that the banks were loaning to, so they believed them to be very secure clients. And the security against the loan was the cotton itself. So if there were any cases of individual bad debtors, then the cotton itself could be taken and sold to make good the loan. However, in the late 50s, the international cotton market changes for a variety of reasons. There are bad yields in Sudan, and there are falling international prices. So lots of the cotton traders end up with large stocks of cotton left over, and it looks like they can't repay their loans to the banks. Now, as we all know, if you're in debt to your bank for £100, that's your problem. If you're in debt to your bank for £1 million, then suddenly that's the bank's problem. So the banks thought they were giving out very sure and certain loans, and then all of a sudden, and they thought they were tracing movements in the real economy, that they granted a loan, this was then withdrawn as wages for workers, it suddenly materialized in the form of cotton, the cotton was then exported, and the cycle continued. All of a sudden, the numbers in their balance sheets were associated with cotton that wasn't moving, that wasn't going anywhere. And these were just numbers written in books, in the asset column, remember. The cotton was suddenly not worth what they thought it was worth. If everyone's trying to sell, suddenly the amount of value you think there is in the economy, recorded in fixed assets, suddenly gets wiped out. And suddenly the status of these numbers as assets is called into question. It's sat there in the asset column, but it's not going to turn into money anytime soon. It's associated with cotton that can't get sold. So the banks have to sit down with the cotton customers and negotiate repayment schedules. But it gets more complicated than that. Many of the people in the cotton economy were also prominent politicians and even religious figures in Sudan. So some of the British banks, like Barclays, decided they were going to hide the insolvent status of their customers in their own accounts and only record it on their London accounts. They hid this from the Sudanese tax authorities, ironically overstating their profits and the amount they wanted to make to hide the fact that the banks were potentially insolvent. But another problem occurred as well. In theory, the banks could have forced the cotton clients to sell off their property holdings in order to pay down these loans. But that would have destroyed the business making, the revenue generating potential of these businesses. In order to acquire a revenue to pay down these loans, the cotton clients needed to produce cotton in future seasons and export it. For that to work, they needed bank finance, so the banks needed to refinance these customers. So I'd like to argue several things. Firstly, this is a moment of crisis, clearly, because a lot of value is suddenly immobilized and risks being destroyed or written off, I think a very insightful term. And because it's a moment of crisis, the power relations that were there all along between debtor and creditor, between expatriate bank and domestic cotton producer, some of whom were Sudanese, some of whom were European, become explicit. But as well as becoming explicit, they're sometimes inversed. Because if the cotton clients, if the debtors all default, that's a problem for the banks as well. And their business model in Sudan is destroyed. And finally, I'd like to argue that this is a moment of accounting. This is a moment where value is created or destroyed through negotiation between state actors, between private business people, and between banks. But it's accounting that escapes the control of accountants, escapes the routine control of company accountants. So it's a moment when the fact that accounting is a social process rather than a technical process becomes explicit. And these bad and doubtful debts remained on the bank's books until 1970, when both the banks and the large cotton clients were nationalized by the socialist government in Sudan. I've got a second example there about the liquidation of Credit Lyonnais in Sudan. I'm going to skip over that for time. So I'm going to take a second example, which is the nationalizations of banks. There was the Free Officers' Coup in Sudan in 1969 with socialist and communist elements, and the following year they nationalized foreign firms, leading to direct negotiations with these foreign clients, and in the case of the British firms, the UK Foreign Office, over the terms of compensation. And again, I'd like to argue that these are debates over accounting, but it's accounting that's become, I don't want to say politicized, because I'd like to argue it's always political and always about power, but the power question becomes explicit in this moment of crisis. And the banks are attempting to return the control over the measure and circulation of value to their accountants and the routine activities of accountants. So there's this argument from the nationalized British companies that compensation should be prompt, fair, and effective. And I only learned recently that this language is actually taken from the 1930s nationalization of petroleum firms in Mexico, and that Western governments and firms have since tried to use that as a precedent in international law to call for what they saw as fair terms of compensation after nationalization. The Sudanese government wanted to nationalize in Sudanese bonds, which they argued was not effective because it was not internationally transferable. And one of the nationalized companies says, this matter of assessing by committee, by committees appointed by the Sudanese government, should be unnecessary in the case of well-established expatriate companies with proper and auditing accounts. With good accounting, there's no debate to be had over the value of a company. But you contrast that with what another British company said, which is that the owner of a company should be able to argue for what basis of valuation he considers best: net asset value, replacement value, capitalizing the net maintainable revenue of the enterprise. The details aren't important, but this makes the fact that accounting is based on conventions, which accountants are aware of, very explicit. And this is suddenly quite a political question because it determines the degree of compensation. And again, this funny statement that compensation should be based on the price paid by a willing buyer to a willing seller in the open market. And given that this is a forced nationalization by a revolutionary government, that's quite an extraordinary claim, one could argue. National Grindlays, the bank, says, not only do we want to be compensated for our current assets, we want to be compensated for 10 years' profits before tax. But then they say, we could come down to 8 years' profits, and maybe even slightly less. Okay, you might say this is straightforward haggling, like in the marketplace. But what's funny is that the levels of money they're asking for are associated with very specific accounting claims about capitalized future profits. So all sorts of questions of accounting convention come in. At the end of the day, it's the Sudanese government that buckles. There's a counter-coup in Sudan where the communist supporters of the regime are violently liquidated. Jaffa Nimeri reinvents himself as a technocrat, wants to turn on the taps again to foreign aid, and agrees to nationalisation largely on the terms of UK companies. Now you might say, okay, so what? This is just haggling, and all this stuff about accounting, concepts and convention, that's just speak, that doesn't mean anything. I'd argue, first of all, that this is about the creation of norms. The foreign companies are trying to refer to what they believe is legal precedent. They're asking for the intervention of the IMF and the World Bank, not to explicitly take their part. They're not questioning the legal right of Sudan to nationalise. They're saying it could make Sudan less creditworthy, less able to meet the obligations of its creditors. So they're trying to make reference to particular norms. It's the limit of a reformist and revolutionary political project in Sudan. There's a socialist coup, they're willing to nationalise firms, but they're not able to move beyond a language of value that is extremely embedded in the routine mechanisms of the international capitalist economy. And in various of these moments of crisis, the hidden power relations that exist in the movements of value become open and explicit, and accounting escapes the roles of accountants. Finally, I think there's a lot to be said about the fact that Sudanese pounds were rejected as a means of payment. Firstly, when Credit Lyonnais sold part of its shares to the Sudanese bank in 1965, the example I didn't look at, they weren't arguing over how much their business was worth. They didn't care about that. What they cared about was the currency within which the payment was made, and they wanted French transferable francs, because they wanted to be able to remit it to Europe. And similarly, a big bust-up in 1970 is about receiving payment in sterling, not in Sudanese pounds. So this is a key way in the Bretton Woods moment of fixed capital controls, which was supposed to enhance state sovereignty. The currencies of decolonized states get devalued, metaphorically, as a means of payment, which makes possible their market devaluation later on in the 70s and 80s as neoliberalism and structural adjustment programs kick in. So I see my 15 minutes are up, and I thank you very much and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harry Cross. We give the floor to Ms. Ingrid Harvold Kvangraven, right?
You can just say Ingrid.
Thank you very much. So your presentation is the financialization on the African continent. Is it real, and what does it imply, right?
Yes, thank you. Well, I changed the title, actually, since I submitted the abstract. But yes, more or less. So, hi everyone. I'm Ingrid, and I'm presenting a paper that I wrote with Ndongo and Kai, who you know, who are also here in the audience, who can chip in if they feel compelled to do so. And so we're a part of this research group with heterodox economists that are working on financialization. And when we were invited to contribute to a special issue we were asked to write about financialization in Africa, we took that as an opportunity to explore what are the debates on financialization, particularly in the heterodox literature, and how can it be applied in an African context. So it's largely an exploratory paper, as you'll see. So one of the motivations, how do the developments in African countries fit with this literature? And I'll talk a little bit more about what this literature is. And how does it change or relate to how capital accumulation is happening? Is this systemic change, or is it a continuation of capitalist accumulation, the way we've seen it operating in many, many years already? So is it a new stage, or is it just a continuation? So basically, I will take you through these 4 points. First, briefly explore the debates on African financialization, explore the general trends, and the processes in 4 different countries. And I think I'll focus mostly on this third point, since I don't have that much time, 3 minutes on average per point, I guess. And then some preliminary conclusions and some gaps in the literature. So the debates. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the debates already, but in some present it as a new way of extracting value, even though finance and money has always been at the heart of capital accumulation, right? And some see it as an increasing role of financial motives, markets, actors. That's like one of the most famous definitions, I guess, by Epstein, in the way that domestic and international economies work. So the financial subordination literature, which is mostly pioneered by Bonizzi, Kaltenbrunner, and Powell. Powell was the one who coined the term. Distinguish between cyclical processes and like secular changes to capitalism. So this is what I'll get back to a little bit and a part of our motivation for doing this. So subordinate financialization is so there's Keynesians and Marxists working on this. So it's kind of it's not a theoretical, it's not a theory in itself, but more of a theoretical approach to issues of financialization in developing countries. And it was Jeff Powell who first started looking at Mexico, looking at how the financial markets were changing, they were getting deeper, they were financializing, but at the same time, the domestic firms were underfinanced, and they were experiencing all these financial constraints. So it's a form of financialization that's subordinate. So that's a very brief summary of the theoretical approach. And since then, since he wrote his Ph.D. thesis on this, it has been applied lots of places, mostly in Latin American and Asian countries. I haven't seen it applied in African countries yet. And it's interesting because it doesn't just look at finance, it connects the production, the sphere of production and the sphere of finance, to look at the link between these and how financial development affects firms and how the financial constraints that firms face. And then there's the financial deepening in development literature, which is the mainstream way of approaching finance and development. And that literature has engaged with African context to a much larger extent than the heterodox literature. So they focus on the developments of new markets, local currency debt, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, private sector debt, and financial inclusion. We can talk more about that later as well. Financialization in Africa, so there's quite a lot of literature on the extractive role of finance in Africa, not so much on financialization, with the important exception, of course, of scholars working on South Africa. But in terms of the role of finance, there is a lot of old literature too, like by Samiramin and Nkrumah and others, that is relevant, I think, also today. So, second point, the general trend. So I'll just, maybe it's kind of like stylized facts that I'll be presenting, things that we see that are changing in relation to finance in Africa. And I'll go a bit quickly since I thought I had 20 minutes, but I know I only have 15. So there's a restructuring of the financial systems, and I think it's very familiar to all of you already, that we've seen in the past 30, 40 years, dismantling of barriers to free mobility of capital, financial liberalization, elimination of credit and interest controls, development of these missing markets like stock markets, for example, other financial markets. Financial integration, and how it has been a destabilizing force for African countries, not just African countries actually, but in this context that's what we're talking about. So financialization has led to this increased exposure to volatile capital flows, right? Financialization has expanded dictate of financial profitability is another aspect of the developments. So you see this, for example, in the way social provisioning has shifted towards more private solutions. Bayliss and Weinberg have written quite a lot about this, also with public-private partnerships, and also with international development agendas, as Daniela Gabor has written about. How World Bank and IMF are now increasingly pushing this, what she calls Wall Street consensus, which is related to countries needing to develop their financial markets in order to develop in a variety of ways. And then it's an empirical question whether financialization is leading to an actual increase in the financial sector in relation to the real sector. In advanced countries, that has been an empirical stylized fact, and we're exploring this in an African context, if this is actually happening, to what extent it's happening, and the effects that that might have. Okay, so just briefly, just to not only focus on the financial side, but also the real economy a little bit, foreign direct investment has been increasing. So this is African economies from 1987% of GDP to 40%, which is, a very significant amount and higher than the other regions, developing economies regions. When it comes to foreign debt, I decided to just summarize in points rather than throw a lot of graphs at you. There's been a decreasing amount of concessionality, increased borrowing from non-traditional and private lenders. So this is something that Ian Taylor calls diversified dependence. He's written a book on this. So you have China coming in, for example. It's a big example that everyone points to, but also Brazil and others, and private lenders also. And then issuance of Eurobonds is a part of this. So this was, often framed in the Africa Rising narrative when African countries, other than South Africa, started issuing bonds in 2006, which was largely affected by, the investors were largely driven by global liquidity and the commodity boom in those countries that were issuing the bonds. So again, it isn't just about what African countries decide to do. It's of course largely affected by what's going on in the global economy. And then local currency bond markets are promoted and thought to lead to development, so they've been slowly developing in a lot of African countries. They're still very narrow and shallow, mostly, and in some countries there's a very strong presence of foreign investors. In Ghana as an example of that. Now I will throw some graphs at you. I don't know if you can see very well, but the point of this graph is basically saying that we chose a measure to separate between financially connected and financially non-connected countries in Africa to see or to demonstrate how there's huge differences between different forms of countries. So the ones that we look at as the most connected, so financially connected African countries, we call them, there's 24. There has been a huge increase in private borrowing in these countries. This is external debt as a percent of GDP. And you see that the public borrowing has gone down and private borrowing has gone up. Whereas in the financially non-connected, which is the rest of the African countries, it's fairly stable. This is all publicly held external debt. So, the stories would be very different depending on which countries we look at. Again, so there's various forms of extraction, as we call it, while increasing borrowing with higher interest rates, which is often the case with private debt. Interest payments would go out of the country, and they have been increasing, but they are very small compared to the FDI income. So it's not necessarily that the extraction in the financial sector or the debt markets are the most significant ones. Okay, now to the case studies. Yeah. So we were constrained by data, as everyone is who looks at this region. But we chose 4 countries that are interesting because they're quite different. So it's Mauritius, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zambia. So these 4 countries are the ones that have the highest external debt held by private actors. So they're quite connected to the private debt market. So they're connected in one sense, but then the question is, how does this relate to the financial development within the countries? How does it relate to development in the real sector? And how has this changed? So first looking at the financial and the real economies. So we looked at a measure of financial depth And here you have, so Mauritius is the blue one, South Africa, the green one, Nigeria, the red, and Zambia, the purple. So you see that financial depth actually in Zambia and Nigeria is actually, well, it's more cyclical than secular for sure, and it actually seems to be declining a little bit. South Africa is stagnating, and Mauritius is financializing, according to this graph, by one measure of financialization, of course. And then we looked at a proxy for productive lending to GDP, as like in the mainstream literature, increasing financial depth is meant to lead to also increased productive lending and increased growth. So you see that this is increased for Mauritius and South Africa, but not actually seems to have decreased for Zambia, and it's or Nigeria, and it's fairly flat for Zambia, which suggests that the real economy is underfinanced in those countries, and there's no sign of improvement there. So, as I mentioned, there's this empirical transformation that's often associated with financialization in advanced countries, which is this increasing size of the financial sector relative to the real economy. And you see that again in Mauritius, South Africa, kind of stagnating, and Zambia and Nigeria, again, kind of cyclical rather than secular. So domestic credit provided by the financial sector, that's this one, and the domestic credit to the private sector is this one. And again, you see the similar trends. No matter what we're looking at, we kind of see the same things, right? Except here, Zambia actually had a pretty high level in the 80s, and then went down. And South Africa and Mauritius saw an increase on both accounts. And then very briefly, I'll just say a little bit about the banking sector. But I think I only have one slide on that, so yeah. So there's been an increase in the degree of oligopolistic banking, according to several studies that have been done in the region. For our case study countries, we have a pretty high percentage of foreign banks, at least for Zambia and Mauritius, at 75%. And relatively low in South Africa and Nigeria, actually. And Zambia and South Africa have seen increasingly monopolistic banking sectors, which is something that was identified already in the 60s by Samir Min, for example. And then I have a graph here on the firms that use banks to finance investments. And you see that in Zambia and Nigeria, that's fairly low. And Mauritius and South Africa, higher. So, on to the conclusions and gaps. And then I have 30 seconds. So this financial framing that we were interested in exploring doesn't seem to be necessarily the best or most helpful framing for at least these 4 countries, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily reveal anything new about the extraction in these countries, at least not systemically different. It's not like, it doesn't seem like there's a radical change, at least for Zambia and Nigeria. So the financial depth, there hasn't been financial deepening to a significant extent, other than in Mauritius. And at the same time, Nigeria and Zambia have these largely underfinanced private sectors by traditional measures. So that says something about how, they're in a subordinate position, but they're not necessarily financializing. So maybe we need a different framework. And you see this dominance of foreign banks as an example of the subordination, but there's more examples that we could also talk more about. So there's more research needed. For example, on in ways that financialization can be extractive, and how this differs from other forms of extraction. Also on the effects of this increase of foreign creditors, and the beginning of the development of local currency debt markets is really being pushed now by the IMF and the World Bank, which Freke will talk more about tomorrow. And there's some interesting questions are what's driving it, who benefits, and who are these investors. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ingrid. Sorry,
Sorry, I just wanted to announce that I just received a letter of the Presidency of the Republic of Tunisia apologizing for not being here with us and wishing us the best for our conference.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now, I wasn't going to talk much about myself, except that because I was introduced as somebody who is going to take you back to the roots, I will spend 2 minutes talking about why I'm taking you back to the roots. Now, when I saw the title of the conference, The Quest for Economic and Monetary Sovereignty in Africa in 21st Century, my question was, which Africa are the organizers thinking about? Because by virtue of my various occupations, now I started as an international civil servant based in Morocco with the African Training and Research Center in Administration for Development, CAPRAD in Tangier. Then I worked in development studies at Sussex University as a research fellow, and then moved to Samir Amin's EDEP. He recruited me and we left together, and then I was with FAO, where I was the FAO's representative to the Organization of African Unity. So I thought I knew Africa, and I thought after visiting over 40 African countries, I knew that there isn't a single African country in the 20th century or the 21st century has sought economic or monetary sovereignty. So when I saw the question, which Africa, the search in Africa, I said, somebody must be doing some wishful thinking. There is no country in Africa which has been in quest of economic and monetary sovereignty. And I will explain why.
Maybe you take this slide. It looks like that one
it's
doesn't
not
work
working
very well. And please, can you put it very close?
Yeah. I found that, you see, and this morning made me very comfortable because we were reminded that if you give up your economic and monetary sovereignty, you've given up your independence. Now, when we are talking about Africa, we are talking about Africa which gave up its economic and monetary sovereignty more than 100 years ago. So it is not a question of in the 20th century or in the 21st century. We do not have any monetary sovereignty to give up. Now, because colonization, every single African country that we can talk of, including Ethiopia and Liberia, which used to claim that they were never colonized, were in fact colonized one way or the other. So we don't have sovereignty to give up. Now the question is, are we searching for sovereignty, financial and economic sovereignty? So there are three areas where I looked, said if there is such a quest for this kind of sovereignty, it must be either at the Pan-African level, at the sub-regional level, or at the country level. Now, at the Pan-African level, I looked at the African Organization of African Unity, which had the Lagos Plan of Action, which talked a little bit about self-reliance, but never about sovereignty. But even the Lagos Plan of Action, with this little noise about economic collective self-reliance, without talking about sovereignty, gave up even that talk of self-reliance under pressure from the so-called development partners. And they dropped the Lagos Plan of Action and went and adopted a document they called NEPAD, New Partnership for Economic Development, which was really a document more or less prepared by the World Bank on the instructions from the from the West. So that was in the 20th century. the 21st century Africa, the only important economic document that has come out of Africa is so-called Agenda 63, which was published by the African Union. And that does not talk about economic or financial or monetary sovereignty. Now we come to the lower levels, at the sub-regional level. You talk of SADC, you have Maghreb African Union, you have ECOWAS. None of them has ever talked about seeking sovereignty. So you don't have a economic or monetary sovereignty to give up. The question is, have you been looking for it? We have not been looking for it at the Pan-African level. At the subcontinental level, SADC, for instance, I'll give you one example. When the West imposed its sanctions on Zimbabwe, of course, Zimbabwe is a member of the Southern African Development Community. They decided at one point to plead with the so-called development partners, with the West, to lift the sanctions. And in the argument that they produced was that now the West has been rationalizing those sanctions on the grounds that Zimbabwe was not democratic. And they must have free and fair elections, hoping that through the free and fair elections, they will get their puppets who will more or less implement decisions that they wanted Robert Mugabe to take, which he was not prepared to take. Now they had those elections, and what SADC was saying was that since they have had those elections, the sanctions have done their job, and therefore the sanctions must be lifted. So it was not arguing that the West has no business even interfering with the sovereignty of Zimbabwe. They were saying that, oh, you have succeeded in doing what you wanted to do, and therefore lift the sanctions. So that is no sign that they were interested in financial economic sovereignty. When you look at ECOWAS, the other sub-regions, the closest has been ECOWAS now talking about the ECO, which is worse than an attempt to carbon copy the European Union's euro. Worse than that, because it simply is hiding the fact that none of the countries has economic monetary sovereignty, not even the countries that pretend that they have national currencies. The debate in West Africa has been CFA countries, their currency is governed by France, the Bank of France and so on, but you have countries like Ghana, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, and so on, who have their own currencies. But apart from the fact that they have pieces of paper with their heads of states, or they used to have heads of state pictures on it and so on, those are fictitious. In fact, their national currencies are as national as their paper flag and what Nyerere called flag and anthem independence. Not a single country in West Africa has economic or financial sovereignty to give up. The only country in Africa which has ever attempted to more or less even challenge the dominance of the foreign currencies was Libya, Gaddafi. But even that was backed by, the attempt was backed by the petrodollar. And even that was too much, and then when he got overthrown and was killed. There hasn't been a single African government which has actually raised the issue of monetary So which quest are we talking about? Are we doing wishful thinking? That was my issue. Now, at the level of Patrick's paper, towards the end, was talking about resistance to, if you like, the situation that we all know. But the masses of Africa, funny enough, there's every objective reason why they must rebel. They must resist the domination of, or the absence of sovereignty, but they have not asked for it. Not even in North Africa, where we had the so-called Arab Spring. The rebellion, including Tunisia, the resistance was to particular regimes and not to, as far as I can see, to the system of being dominated by imperialism. They were rebelling against the local representatives of the global indirect rule. Almost every African country is effectively a Bantustan. And if you are then going to resist, then you must resist not just the regime in place, but the whole system. And there hasn't been that quest. Now, then I ask myself, why do we not have that quest in spite of the fact that there's every reason why we are suffering from the lack of economic and monetary sovereignty? The objective reasons are there, but it has not been followed by actual resistance, either by the state, because the state is too happy playing its comprador role, not by the governments, because the governments are interested, ruling classes are interested in enjoying the benefits of being the comprador or petty bourgeoisie, not by the masses, for reasons that I do not understand, because there was a time when people thought that there was an issue of even lacks of self-confidence, that the African does not seem to have the confidence to think that, he can resist imperial domination of his economy. That's why you have not had a change in the colonial model of development, the colonial management with all its dependency and all that kind of stuff. The question then is, what will it take? And this is where I go back to this Nkrumah. What will it take for us to even begin the quest? And my answer, it goes back to the answer that Kwame Nkrumah gave, seek you first, because we have not actually sought political independence. What our leaders actually sought was the right to enjoy the same kind of freedom that the benefits that the expatriate administrators and the expatriate businessmen were enjoying. So the moment the imperialism was able to cleverly do power sharing with the aspiring petty bourgeoisie, that was the end of the struggle. We have independence. And the masses have also not somehow resisted for reasons which we must, I think, be focused on. And therefore, my issue is we do not appear to have the will to seek this sovereignty that we are talking about. Where do we get it from? That is a research question, it's a political question, and that's what we must be focusing on, seeking first, because then we can modify what Nkrumah was saying, instead of, or interpret it to mean, first of all, we must have the will to be independent, and that is what is lacking. And therefore, when we organize these, attend seminars and do our researches and so on, they should not end up with jamborees, but we must end up seeking to connect with the situation on the ground. The petty bourgeoisie, the working class, the peasantry, and so on. And that is the challenge, rather than pretending that there's a quest for sovereignty in Africa which does not exist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Tony Obeng. We go for the last presentation with Mr. Okoli Chukwuma towards the sovereignty, a collective economic sovereignty.
Thank you, everyone. The title of my presentation reads, Africa and the Globalization Bargain Towards a Collective Economic Sovereignty. Incidentally, it appears to me that some vital aspect of my submission, have been preempted already. And I'm afraid some have been apparently negated. Nonetheless, I wonder if I still have a paper to present anyway. Well, it's about African story in the era of globalization. We're talking about where we stand and how we stand in the asymmetries of interdependence that we assume characterize the globalizing world. I'll start by making some preliminary remarks. First, to note that Africa's existential situation in the prevailing order of globalization is such that no state should take the issue of national sovereignty seriously. That has come up here so strongly. Apart from the myriad of challenges, structural, political, Africa today is faced with a gamut of political challenges, economic challenges that can only be addressed meaningfully through some form of strategic multilateral collaboration. Africa's aspiration to economic sovereignty has been constrained by the structural conditionality of globalization, and then that has actually kept Africa virtually weak, underdeveloped, and dependent. We note as well that the constraint is so immanent that individual African states can hardly afford even the relative sovereignty to harness a strategic balance in these fast ossifying asymmetries of interdependence. Now, the focus of the paper. The paper seeks to rethink the extant perspective on sovereignty and underscore the imperative for a collective economic sovereignty for Africa, given the exigencies of globalization. And it is hoped that the outcome will be able to stimulate scholarly and policy endeavors in respect of how to deal with the challenge at hand. This is Africa alongside the disparate sovereignties within the operational context of globalization. Now we look at the notion of sovereignty. We have three strands of the notion. One, national sovereignty, which actually implies sovereign power, public power, which has the right and in theory the capacity to impose its authority in the last instance. Popular sovereignty that refers to the holder of a legitimate power who is recognized to have authority. And then in the context of international relations, we look at sovereignty as independence, that is, non-interference by external powers in the internal affairs of another state, based on the principle of sovereign equality of nations, sovereign equality of independent states, and of course, the inviolability of territoriality. Of course, the notion of inviolability of a nation state is contestable, particularly in the era of globalization. Now, we'll go further to look at the two dominant perspectives to sovereignty, the Westphalian status and the new liberal status. I wouldn't want to dwell much on that. Just to note that here in the Westphalian model, we're talking about principle of interference, and here we are concerned with principle of non-indifference. Here, the emphasis is on territorialization, and there the emphasis is on deterritorialization. Here, we're talking about an inward-looking national security there, both inward and outward-looking national security. Here, we're talking about a unilateralist pursuit of national interest, and there, it's all about multilateralist approach to national. Here, it is state-centric, and there is citizenry-centric, and that is the notion of popular sovereignty. Here we're talking about sovereignty in the sense of pro-defense and state preservation. There we're talking about pro-development approach to sovereignty. Now, we pose this question, in the liberal orthodox literature, it's often assumed that globalization presupposes a sort of mutual interdependence among nations. But it's a matter of perspective anyway. Scholars who subscribe to Marxism, and of course the whole lot of radical scholars would want to assume that that is not true. They will rather argue that it's simply a worldwide ascendancy of capitalism. Whereas liberal scholars will assume that globalization is a sort of internationalization of benefits and threat, to some extent anyway. What Montesquieu referred to as sweet ties of commerce, which brings forth mutually beneficial outcomes. Radical scholars seem to believe that globalization is essentially characterized by asymmetries of interdependence. And the gains and burdens of globalization are not actually equally, they're not favorable in terms of, it depends on where a state stands in the spectrum of the process. Now we look at globalization as it stood then and now. First, we consider globalization as a counterpoint of sovereignty, national sovereignty. If you go into literature, the consensus there is that globalization is actually de-sovereignization, that it has eroded national sovereignty, it has rendered it quite obsolete. And so, the Westphalian notion of sovereignty has been so negotiated by the dynamics, by the forces of globalization. You find flows, transnational flows, cross-border flows, like ideas, goods, money, drugs, virus, and so on, threatening or negating territoriality of states. Now, we look at the neoliberal stance of sovereignty. And then we know that sovereignty is no longer a sanctuary. And so territoriality is not sacrosanct anymore in the context of globalization. And so sovereignty is not only becoming weakened, but it needs to become weaker. That is what we are seeing. And that is the imperative of globalization. How many minutes? Okay. Now we look at economic sovereignty, and we note here that it has to do with the right to continue and preserve economic activities closely linked to the existence of state, unencumbered by external and external forces. And we note, and this is important, that sovereignty, economic sovereignty, is actually the foundation of national sovereignty. As a matter of fact, that is the very quintessence of sovereignty. A nation that doesn't have economic sovereignty can't boast of having any form of sovereignty whatsoever. We looked at limitations of sovereignty. The activities of IMF, WTO, and so on, how they actually limit and negate the national sovereignty of nations. And we look at some commitment undertaken by nations voluntarily, and how they also, multilateral and bilateral commitment, and how they also limit sovereignty of nations. And we looked at issues like deregulation and reductions in public spending, the activities of multinational corporations, and the question of dollarization that has come up here too. Financial dependency. Now, in the prevailing era of globalization, African states are persuaded, often cajoled or constrained to make some substantive concessions that divest of their economic sovereignty through a variety of means, including means that actually target their fiscal domain. Now, we look at the prevailing economic situations in Africa, and we know that given her peculiarity as a weak, underdeveloped, and dependent nation, it stands vulnerable in this relationship, economic and whatever, power relations that characterize this era. And from this position of vulnerability, Africa finds it difficult to really compete meaningfully in terms of pursuing our national interests and making good our national sovereignty. We look at this just to illustrate what we mean by that, globalization and Africa's competitive strength. You find Africa looking weak and vulnerable in a tug-of-war challenge, sort of, with the big players looking strong and viable in the asymmetries of interdependence. And this is not a fair competition. Looking at it, I think it depicts something of survival of the fittest, and worse still, the elimination of the unfit. That is the African situation. And then we have 54 states in Africa, but what about our competitive strength? Our competitive strength. What is it what? Is it like 54 mice against one lion? I guess that is what it is. We are therefore making a case for a formidable front. And that brings us to the idea of a collective economic sovereignty. The way it stands today, since no African nation can really boast of any meaningful stamina to really pursue national sovereignty, I think the best option for us is to find a way of coming up with a sort of collective platform that will enable us to assume more stake in the context of globalization. And so we're making a case for a sort of liberalized and distributed sovereignty. Could be subnational, national, and supranational. The multilateralist approach to economic sovereignty for Africa promises to do a lot of things. For one thing, it mediates the individual vulnerabilities of states and boosts their competitive bargaining power. And a lot more. What we need to do is perhaps to capitalize on the existing subnational and supranational platforms. And of course, we have quite a number of regional economic communities, the ECOWAS, and showing they're making some progress amidst challenges.
Time is up.
Again.
Are we close to finishing, please?
It's okay. So the case is simple. We are looking at how to transcend our individualism. Okay, and maybe make a case for a sort of collectivism that will guarantee some strategic common good. And that is what is depicted here. If we go collective, we stand to gain. If we go individualist, I think that is a serious challenge. And so the solution is that given our peculiarity and, of course, given where we stand in this context of the asymmetries of globalization, the best option for us is to find a way of pulling our stake together in a manner that will guarantee a more bargaining competitive power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chukwuma. Thank you. Please come take a seat. Then I think we have some time for questions. Please come sit. I give the floor to the audience now. It's yours. I see a question here.
My question is for Mr. Tony Obeng. So, if I understood well, you said that the only country who sought economic sovereignty was Libya under Gaddafi in Africa. So, I want to ask what you think about the stance of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso and his critics about the IMF and World Bank, and what we can learn from him for economic sovereignty in general.
Thank you very much. My question is for Mr. Obeng. First of all, I think, let me thank you for a thought-provoking presentation. But I'm not sure I agree with you on your NEPAD characterization of NEPAD. My understanding of NEPAD is that it was actually designed by South Africans, and it was supposed to be the spearhead for advancing South African capital across Africa. So I'm not sure about, despite its neoliberal policies, I'm not sure it was designed in the West. I think it's something really original about Africa. That's first. Then the second one I have, it's about, you were so pessimistic about the whole concept of Africa. Now, of course, and I was just wondering, and you talked about seeking for political independence, which I believe, I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on Nkrumah, but I believe he said that before Ghana got its political independence. And Nkrumah, of course, reigned, and this is about 60-something years after Nkrumah, Ghana got its independence under Nkrumah. And still, you paint this kind of picture of hopelessness. That's my interpretation. I'm not sure I'm right. But and I was just wondering, what do you think is the way forward in concrete terms for Africa, or is it that there is no way forward, that we should go to our villages and die? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for these interesting presentations. I have a question to Ingrid. We had this already a bit over dinner last night. I will pose now the question a bit more concrete maybe. We had the discussion about the variables you chose, and I was wondering whether you integrated like the individual adaptedness and the question of financial inclusion, and whether companies are also micro companies, like all these informal sector, so-called informal sector, whether it's somehow integrated because you have all these microloans, etc. Because I was a bit surprised about your findings.
Okay, a lot of questions. I think we'll let oui, on va venir à vous. Excusez-moi, on va prendre 3 questions à la fois et puis passer aux autres personnes. Excusez-moi. I give the floor to you, Mr. Obeng, to answer, please.
This is the one that was not working. Oh, it's working now. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I am not optimistic or pessimistic. I'm simply saying, and when you go back to this, seek ye first the political kingdom, and I said that with hindsight, it should be interpreted to mean, first of all, you must have the will to be free. That is what is lacking. I'm not saying that you have to be pessimistic or optimistic, but you must want to be free. And without that, you cannot even begin to talk about economic or monetary sovereignty. Now, when you live in a country or when you are operating an economy, which is such that when Thomas Cook collapses, you start shaking, you can do all the Arab Spring that you want. It is not going to change. It's not going to give you economic sovereignty. It is not going to give you monetary sovereignty. So I'm not saying that you should not try. I'm saying that you must have the will to try, which is so far lacking. Not a single African country, after so-called independence, has moved from the colonial produce for export model. And unless we are prepared to change those, we are not going to go anywhere. Now, the question that I was asked whether about Sankara, I'm not saying that Sankara was not a radical. I'm not saying that Nkrumah was not a radical in their own period and so on. But they changed virtually nothing. I mean, there was a lot of populism, but they were not able to move their countries from where the colonialists, from the colonial economic model and from the colonial development. Colonial development was transformed into development. Industrialization, Nkrumah tried industrialization by import substitution, but that really amounted to what Samira Mendes Smith as industrialization by import replication. If Europe, as part of its industrialization, decided, you see, the human being, whether you are European or African, you need vitamin C. Europe, because of their specific factor endowments and factor constraints, they thought of producing factories that make vitamin C tablets to satisfy the human need for vitamin C. You look at Africa and you say that you are industrializing by making vitamin C tablets instead of growing more oranges and finding some way of preserving them so that your people can have access to vitamin C all year round. Without copying the European model, you cannot even begin to tell me that you are aiming at economic or monetary sovereignty. Now, as to whether, NEPAD, yes, on paper, NEPAD was, Thabo Mbeki, Senegal, Abdoulaye Wade, and so on. But we know who they were. They were agents of neoliberalism. Thank you.
Thanks for asking that question, which allows me to clarify and also add a little bit to the paper that I didn't talk about. So, of course, this like empirical trend of rising household debt is something that is strongly associated with financialization in the advanced countries and with the financialization literature. So we did want to look at that as well in these countries, but we're somewhat constrained with data, at least at like the aggregate level. So, but we do have a discussion on it. The only country that had aggregate data on it was South Africa, which had a rise in household debt to a certain extent, but it flattened out like the last decade, which is kind of interesting, but that's formal debt, right? So it hides a lot of the informal lending that's going on. So, I mean, there's literature out there on how microfinance in the informal sector, but also is becoming more formalized with electronic payment systems, is, increasingly drawing people into the financial sector and through cash transfers, becoming, through electronic payment systems. And, there's, like in South Africa, there's been quite a lot of problems related to this, because instead of all these poor people borrowing to become entrepreneurs, they actually just become more indebted and they end up in crisis, right? So I definitely think it's a very important aspect of it. And there also is some evidence from Zambia on increasing indebtedness through microfinance organizations. But we weren't able to find that much data on the other countries, but definitely something that's a very important aspect as well that needs to be further investigated. Yes. Yes. Data is political.
I'm interested in this. It's actually a kind of remark for Professor Obeng. Yes. Thank you for your presentation. I feel like you're endowed with Fanon spirit and MES spirit. I mean, yeah, really. I just want to add one thing, which is in the Tunisian context. We have, you've been talking about the NEPA, and we have in Tunisia here something which is called the ALICA, l'Accord de libre-échange complet et approfondi. Actually, I was expecting a kind of debate in this conference, but it did not happen. Anyway, the ALICA actually reminded me of the condition of Tunisia in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, the pre-colonial period, where Tunisia was up to its neck into debts, and the Beylical government was like a puppet government, which is the case now, I believe. And yes, so my point here is that I think there is no such a thing as a post-colonial period. I mean, there is no like a clear-cut separation between periods. There is a continuity, and there is because colonialism is a whole process. So I opt for the post-colonial label. I mean, the non-hyphenate post-colonial label. So. I mean, yesterday someone was talking about the condition. Okay, so I'll pass directly to my question. Yeah. So speaking about the ALICA polemical issue and the public opinion and so on, I'm really looking for some alternatives here, like radical alternatives. I mean, we Africans and youth especially, we are sick and tired of playing the victim role. I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I'm really hoping for some like alternatives. So, are you alluding in your analysis for a Fanonian perception? For example, the peasant being the real actor or the real change maker here, the peasant and the Tunisian or the African proletariat.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to make a comment, if I may, which I was going to leave to the very final session of the whole conference, but I'm stimulated by the very strong intervention by Mr. Obeng to make this now. I've heard the title of the session is "What's the Meaning of Economic Sovereignty?" And there are two answers that have been kicking around this conference which come into conflict with each other, and that conflict hasn't been identified and resolved. So I want to do it now. The question is, do you lack sovereignty when you cannot issue your own currency as a government, or when the government cannot issue its own debt? Let me say it again. Do you lack sovereignty if you can't issue your own currency, or if you can't issue debt as a government? Now, I want to suggest that, I think you quoted Nyerere as saying he didn't want the independence of anthems and paper. Right, flag and anthem. Well, he might also have added paper and paper currencies, because a bunch of African countries can issue their own paper currencies or in various forms and yet remain without sovereignty. And the problem that they face is that they've run out of scope or run out of ability to issue debt, either debt to domestic creditors or foreign creditors. Doesn't make any difference. But this, it seems to me, is an unresolved issue in all of the debates in this conference. Do you need to have new kinds of money, or do you need to explore ways to relieve the constraints of governments on issuing debt? My own view from my own presentation, for those who are here, is you've got to solve the debt side. But other people may have a different view.
Thank you. There's a question or two there, in order not to be biased by my orientation in the room.
Hi, I had a question for Harry about the state as the lender of last resort in both cases that you showed, because I'm wondering if in your 58 case, how the state role played in kind of like maintaining the system of dubious debt. And obviously in the context of Tunisia, this was way later in the 80s and 90s, but this was part of it. And then also in how, if the state was in some way the lender of last resort, how that helped the nationalization of banks later on. Thank you.
Please, it's yours. 3 questions at a time.
Thank you. I think all the questions addressed to me in the second round can be answered with one example. You see, I was challenged to think of an alternative. The alternative for me is not a question of whether you're controlling money or paper money, or your money is backed by gold, or you inherited a colonial model where you are forced to trade, quote unquote. Now, somebody said this morning that when you trade, anytime you trade, you lose sovereignty. The alternative, I would say, is that forget about whether it's money or the bank or paper. Are you now having an economy which enables you to grow as much as possible what you eat, produce what you eat, and to satisfy your human needs, physiological needs, social needs, and ego needs, or whether you are forced to sell your sunshine and your beaches so that anytime Thomas Cook collapses, you start crying, or whether, I mean, it's simple as that. It's not a question of whether you print money or you don't print money. You have moved away from an economy where you look, a situation where you look at your resources and say, what can we do with those resources to satisfy the human need for housing, clothing, and food, physiological needs, social needs, or are we continue to run an economy where we either grow arachid for export, cocoa, or when we say we are lucky, then we start looking for oil not knowing very well that, fossil fuels are under attack, and then you are going to say that we are talking about economic paper currency or economic sovereignty. I say, let's go down to brass tacks and see what we can do with what we have. Then, it does not mean autarky, but it means that if you are going to trade at all, it's not because you need trade to survive, but you need trade to supplement, for luxury and other things.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'll answer first this sort of macro question about what is sovereignty, because it's a good question, and that sort of overarching question of the conference. And I agree we've had too much focus on what I would consider to be the technical means of sovereignty. So this morning there was a paper on the euro, which was very interesting, but it made the claim that countries, by virtue of being members of the Eurozone, are effectively colonies. And I'm not sure that I agree with that, because Italy and Greece, if the mood took them, are sovereign governments and could leave the euro and issue their own currency. There'd be a trade-off, sure, but if that was the political judgment they wanted to make, they could do that. Similarly, any African country who takes the mood, if the mood takes them, can issue both their own currency and their own debt, and there's a trade-off, and the trade-off is different. So the question is about more underlying questions of power, which is why I like some of the other interventions that have spoken about building political power to address and fight back against the limits over how states exert their monetary sovereignty in an unequal global economy and a context of class war. So I think that's what I would emphasize. Regarding the question of the state of last resort, it's very interesting, and interesting in the post-colonial context, I think, about commodity production. So to break down the cotton story a bit more, the financing went to two things. It went to production and to export. And production was more complicated than the export. That wasn't just done by the large companies. That was also done by small private producers. And the banks, their long-standing rule was not to finance the private producers, because there they weren't sure there was the same level of security, they weren't able to track them down if they went bad on their repayments, and it was potentially a longer-term loan. But then in the midst of the boom, they started loaning more to those smaller producers, and then suddenly wanted to pull out of it again in '58. And here there was absolutely an attempt to shift that burden onto the state, onto the Sudanese state. Barclays unilaterally withdrew its financing to those small producers and tried to push it onto the agricultural bank that had just been set up by the Sudanese government. And it could do that because that was financing that was done in Sudanese pounds, in the currency that was issued by the Sudanese government. When it came to the nationalizations, that was a completely different question, because then it was foreign companies that were being nationalized. The Sudanese government was perfectly happy to bail them out, as it were, to pay them their compensation, but in Sudanese treasury bills. And there they weren't interested. So there the debate was over the form of the compensation, and the companies were very aware that Sudan was not a country with high levels of foreign exchange coming in and out of the country every year. So it was an interesting moment where, in what to one extent is a weakness, potentially, of the Sudanese government, its lack of foreign exchange, sort of upsets the power dynamic when it's exerting its legal right to nationalize companies, because the companies might push for compensation in sterling, but they know full well that the Sudanese government can't afford it. So that enters this big ambiguous question that sets the companies of what are they actually calling for, and the conclusion's kind of weird that the Foreign Office archives of the UK show that they're quite aware that they're paying for the compensation in sterling of the British nationalised firms through the aid they're paying to Sudan. And I'm not quite sure why the Foreign Office is so relaxed and happy to do that. But there you go. But I guess someone would say that's what the Foreign Office and the British state is there for in general, if nothing else, and to bail out British firms.
Okay. A question here, there, and then I come to...
Bonsoir. Je m'appelle Abdeltif Fatmani. Je vais parler de 3 points. Ensuite, je ferai une proposition. Le premier point, c'est que l'Afrique a été dominée depuis le XVe siècle par le Portugal. Ensuite, l'Afrique a été colonisée par les Européens. Et c'était une colonisation militaire. Ensuite, après la colonisation militaire, on a eu une nouvelle colonisation qui a battu en brèche la souveraineté nationale des pays, à savoir la colonisation financière. C'est cette financiarisation qui a fait que cette Afrique n'a pas pu relever la tête et n'a pas pu devenir souveraine. Ma proposition est très simple. Il faut que les Africains pensent à des pôles de fédération. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Excuse me. There's a question there. Okay.
Bonjour encore à tous et à toutes. Je me présente, je m'appelle Merveille, originaire de la République démocratique du Congo. Je suis un ingénieur financier. Ok. Ma question s'adresserait à madame qui venait de parler sur la financialisation sur le continent africain. En fait, je vais voir ça dans les pôles avec une documentation qui a été élaborée par l'Union africaine concernant l'agenda 2063 pour une Afrique prospère et évoluée. Bon, j'aimerais savoir parce que oui, en fait, oui. Pour y revenir, ma question porte sur la thématique que vous venez de parler, qui est la financialisation sur le continent africain. Alors, je suis en train de voir ça dans le côté, par exemple, par rapport à la documentation qui avait été élaborée par l'Union africaine concernant l'agenda 2063. Et cet agenda, ça constitue c'est pour une Afrique meilleure, prospère et évoluée. Alors, j'aimerais savoir vraiment quelles sont vos perspectives futures par rapport à ces continents, étant donné que c'est le berceau de l'humanité, par rapport aux opportunités des investissements ici dans notre continent, puisque on n'ignorons jamais cela, que l'avenir se trouve ici dans notre continent. Et j'aimerais savoir quelles sont vos perspectives pour pouvoir aider ce continent, la population, la jeunesse, tous les vieillards, tous ces gens-là, à pouvoir aussi bénéficier de cette financialisation dans l'espace continental. Notamment, quand je prends par exemple le cas de la République démocratique du Congo, qui est un pays aussi ouvert et situé au centre de l'Afrique, et aussi il partage plusieurs frontières avec plusieurs États. Merci.
I see a lot of hands, but I am forced, because of time constraint, to take only 2 more questions. We can have the time to chat over the break afterwards. Really, sorry. You're giving up. Okay. You're sure? Okay. Hands up for questions. There's a question there.
Thank you for your insightful presentations. My question is about the shortage of data. When it comes to sovereignty, you need data, you need some research. The problem is at the level of government? Is there a blackout when it comes to governments, or is it on the international level, like the international organizations, or is it the lack of work, research on the part of academics or think tanks? Thank you.
Thank you. A last question.
Ma question, pourquoi, c'est-à-dire l'homme africain ou l'opérateur économique africain ne profite pas de progrès au nom de la souveraineté économique? Je vais vous donner un exemple. Si Alibaba, avec le commerce électronique, il envoie le tapis de Tunis vers le Sénégal, il arrive avant le colis postal de la poste tunisienne. La poste tunisienne, elle va transporter et faire le commerce, c'est-à-dire avec le Sénégal, après 3 jours ou 1 semaine. Et peut-être le colis n'arrive pas. Et pour quelle raison on ne profite pas de ce progrès et on travaille dans le cadre de co-développement? C'est-à-dire, on travaille ensemble, on profite ensemble, comme elle a fait la Chine. Il ne faut pas voir la souveraineté d'une façon théorique, il faut voir le pratique maintenant. On rentre dans le monde de globalisation, de mondialisation, etc. Deuxièmement, et je termine, hier on dit qu'en Afrique il y a l'économie informelle, etc. Il y a un problème, c'est un fléau. Non, il y a l'économie souterraine. Et pour quelle raison il y a l'économie souterraine? Parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'entreprises qui n'ont pas trouvé l'accès au marché facile. Et l'État n'a rien fait pour faciliter l'accès au marché de ces micro ou petites entreprises. Il ne faut pas oublier les gens qui se plaignent de l'économie souterraine, c'est-à-dire qui travaillent comme quoi dans l'économie formelle, ils sont en train de travailler avec l'économie informelle pour le blanchiment de la fraude fiscale et pour le blanchiment de certaines opérations commerciales et pour ne pas payer leurs impôts. Il ne faut pas oublier que l'économie informelle, elle est en train de créer beaucoup d'emplois. La question, ce n'est pas l'économie informelle. Ces gens-là qui importent et qui distribuent, c'est-à-dire le produit dans l'économie informelle pour ne pas payer les impôts, il faut voir ça. Il ne faut pas dire l'économie informelle, c'est un fléau ou elle a un problème. Merci.
Merci. The floor is yours, please. I think there's a question here about the lack of data, and there was also a question.
So I guess that was for me, the data question? Yeah. It's a good question. I think it's much bigger than I can answer well, but in terms of when we were doing the work, where we were finding the gaps, was because we were mostly looking at IMF, World Bank, UN sources. But I think probably could find more if you go to the country level. But I think even there are a lot of gaps. And so Morten Jurven has written a lot about this, the poverty, poor numbers. So that's a good source for like trying to figure out the politics of measuring stuff in an African context. And then I had a question that was about the future prospects for the region, which I think is also a very big question that I don't know if I can answer in short remarks. But in terms of financialization specifically, I think, I mean, it depends, right? So now, I think these international financial institutions are pushing this agenda where, finance is basically considered good for growth still. This is kind of a debate from decades ago now, and like the IMF and World Bank research papers are now saying, okay, there's at some point that, there's an inverted U and finance isn't good for growth anymore. So like this narrative is still very dominant. And I think if, we want African countries to benefit from finance, then we need to kind of dismiss that narrative and look more into how finance is actually impacting the real economy in the various countries. So that it's a kind of it depends answer.
So the last question, maybe you didn't have, it was asked in French and you didn't have all of you the earbuds. The sir asked two questions. One about the narrative around a black economy and how it dominates, and if it's not more appropriate to call it underground economy. And so what do you think about that? That's first. The second one was about the fact that sometimes you send a postal letter from China to Tunisia, it gets faster to you than if you do the same process around Africa. So how can we talk about integrations in such circumstances? Thank you.
En ce qui concerne l'économie informelle, je suis d'accord avec toi, il ne faut pas dire que parce que quelque chose est informel, c'est illégitime. Et c'est un petit peu une définition extérieure de l'activité économique. Et ça remonte à l'idée sur est-ce qu'on peut mesurer et créer des données. Parce que l'économie formelle, c'est de l'activité économique que quelqu'un d'autre est capable de mesurer et en tirer des données. Et pouvoir mesurer des choses statistiquement n'est pas forcément meilleur que des autres façons de voir et comprendre le monde avec le texte, le qualitatif. Donc, c'est pas seulement qu'on n'a pas fait l'effort d'aller chercher les données, mais si on organise nos vies dans une façon qui rend possible l'extraction des données, ça change la vie, ça change l'organisation sociale. C'est une question de pouvoir, de légibilité. Quelqu'un a dit tout à l'heure. Donc, je pense que ce sont des questions très pertinentes. Je vais aussi parler à propos de la fédération. Monsieur en a parlé. Je ne suis pas contre. Des pôles de fédération, et même si c'est pas la fédération politique formelle, juste des moments d'action communs. Dans la crise de dette au tiers-monde aux années 80, Fidel Castro a dit qu'en lieu de renégocier, on peut juste déclarer le défaut collectivement. Et dès qu'on cesse de faire ça à nous seuls, je ne sais pas, la Tunisie, ici, la Grèce là-bas, si on fait ça collectivement, il ne faut que quelques pays qui n'ont pas besoin d'être fédérés politiquement sur tout le temps, mais juste un moment de rapport de pouvoir, d'établir ce rapport de force. Je pense que c'est dans ce moment-là, ce moment de crise, que l'action collective devient importante et capable de changer des choses.
Thank you very much, everyone. Merci à tous. Je pense que c'est bien le moment pour un café. On vous invite au buffet dehors. Merci.